On October 8, 1871, at 9 p.m., the Great Chicago Fire, which is still the most famous disaster in the city's history, began in a small barn at the back of 137 DeCoven Street, owned by Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. There are many opinions about the cause of the beginning of this disaster. One hypothesis points to Mrs. O'Leary's cow dropping a kerosene lamp in the barn. It was this opinion, fanned by the local newspaper, that made the unfortunate cow owner an outcast in town for many years. Other possible causes of the fire include boys smoking near the barn, a neighbor who stole milk and set the barn on fire to cover up the crime. One of the recently emerged versions was expressed by scientists, who suggested that the fire could have occurred as a result of volcanic activity. Recorded at the time in different parts of the world, the fire, driven by the wind, quickly spread through the city. Wooden sidewalks, ships on the river, and nearby buildings contributed to the fire, which burned for 2 days. The fire killed an estimated 200 to 300 people and destroyed much of the city, leaving 90,000 Chicagoans homeless. For several more days, the fire site was so hot that it was impossible to go in. Some buildings survived the fire. These included the Water Tower and the Church of the Holy Family. Strangely enough, despite the tragic nature of the event and the large number of victims, the fire had a very positive impact on the development of the city, as it cleared a large area for new buildings and gave local businessmen the opportunity to rebuild in their own interests. The whole country helped to rebuild Chicago, and 22 years later, the World's Fair was held in the renovated city. A common cause of fires in the Midwest in the fall of 1871 is that the area had suffered through a hot, dry summer, so the winds from that front, which was coming that evening, were capable of producing rapidly growing pockets of flame from available ignition sources, of which there were many in the region. On that hot, dry and windy fall day on the shores of Lake Michigan at the same time as the Great Chicago Fire, 3 other major fires occurred, about 250 miles, 400 kilometers, to the north. The fire consumed the town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin, along with a dozen other villages. The fire killed between 1,200 and 2,500 people and burned an estimated 1.5 million acres, 6,000 square kilometers. The Peshtigo fire resulted in the largest loss of life in American history, but the remoteness of the region meant that it was little noticed at the time, probably because the telegraph lines in Green Bay burned first. On the other side of the lake to the east, the town of Holland, Michigan, and other nearby areas burned. About 100 miles, 160 kilometers north of Holland, the logging community of Manistee also burned in a fire, an event that became known as the Great Michigan Fire. Further east, along the shore of Lake Huron, the fire swept through Port Huron, Michigan, and much of the Thumb area of Michigan. The Great Chicago Fire lasted from October 8 to October 10, 1871. The fire destroyed most of Chicago, and hundreds of residents died. Despite the fact that the fire was one of the biggest disasters of the 19th century, the city immediately began to rebuild, which served to make Chicago one of the most important cities in the United States. The fire destroyed hotels, stores, churches, opera houses, and theaters downtown. As the fire spread, residents sought refuge on the north side of the city, using bridges to cross the North Branch of the Chicago River. The fire soon reached there as well, burning expensive homes on the north side of the city. Thousands of citizens gathered in Lincoln Park and on the shores of Lake Michigan. By Monday evening, the wind had finally died down and a drizzling rain began to fall. The fire subsided, leaving 48 neighborhoods almost completely destroyed. For several days after the fire ended, the burned remains of the houses were so hot that it was impossible to analyze the extent of the destruction. It was finally determined that the fire had destroyed everything in a swath for miles, 6 kilometers long, and an average of 3/4 of a mile, 1 kilometer wide. The total area of the fire was 2,000 acres, 8 square kilometers, including 73 miles, 120 kilometers of roads, 120 miles, 190 kilometers of sidewalks, 2,000 lampposts, 17,500 buildings, at a total cost of $222 million, which is about a third of the city. Of the city's 300,000 residents, 90,000 were left homeless after the fire. 125 bodies were recovered. The official death toll was between 200 and 300, an unprecedentedly low number for fires of this magnitude. Subsequently, other disasters in Chicago took many more lives. 605 people died in the Iroquois Theater fire in 1903, and in 1915, 835 people died when the ship Eastland sank in the Chicago River. Despite this, the Great Chicago Fire remains the most famous disaster in the city's history. Land speculators and business owners immediately began to rebuild the city. In 1871, Joseph Medill was elected mayor of the city and took an active role in rebuilding it and solving its problems. The whole country helped the people of Chicago with money, clothes, food, and furniture. The first cargo with wood for construction arrived on the day when the last burning building was extinguished, and just 22 years later, 20 million people traveled to the city for the World's Fair. Strangely enough, despite the tragic nature of the event and the large number of victims, the fire had a very positive impact on the development of the city, as it cleared a large area for new buildings and gave local businessmen the opportunity to rebuild in their own interests. The whole country helped to rebuild Chicago, and 22 years later, the World's Fair was held in the renovated city. Trouble does not come alone. GOP company pile misfortune. Many residents of the city property was insured against fire, but the policies burned in the fire. And who to turn to? Just imagine, a third of the city was destroyed, and a third of the population was left without a roof over their heads. It was an unprecedented disaster, a catastrophe. However, Chicagoans did not give up. They began to rebuild the city, and in the future Chicago would become one of the most important and significant cities in all of America. This fire pushed Chicago architecture and the Chicago economy forward. The architectural upswing after the fired IT was in Chicago that the first skyscraper in the world was built on the burnt ruins in 1885. The Home Insurance Building, which stood until 1931 and became the starting point in the construction of high-rises. Initially, it was a 10-story building with a height of 42 meters. Later, 2 more floors were added, and its height was 55 meters. Due to the rapid construction and increase in the number of jobs, the population of Chicago also begins to grow rapidly and reaches 1.1 million residents in 1890. In 1892, the University of Chicago was opened in the city, which was also an important event for Chicagoans. The fire itself is a terrible thing. However, it was this fire that prompted the citizens to start rebuilding the city, which resulted in the birth of a new style of architecture, Chicago architecture. And the city's economy recovered rapidly, and not only regained its former positions, but also increased. Friends, I ask you to put a like, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment. It's not hard for you. It's my pleasure. Your activity motivates me to work harder and release videos more often. Thank you for your attention.